previously on 49cc Scoot. I swapped the 28mm Del Orto VHST that comes with the RC1 out for a 34mm Polini PWK to see if it improved acceleration or speed. That was the beginning of a tuning nightmare, with exhaust gas temperatures getting well into the 1300s to even 1400 degrees Fahrenheit toward the end of an 8th mile run, unless I used the 250 main jet or no main jet at all, but performance fell off. People that I've talked to or read about with 34mm PWKs on these engines seem to most commonly be in the 175 to 195 main jet range, and mine ran strong there, but was also scary hot toward the end of every run. I tested a bunch of main jets and needles, and I even tried a friend's identical carb known to work on his RC1 and still got nowhere. I went back to the Del Orto VHST and the engine ran fine again, but I switched back to the PWK anyway to see if I could figure out what was happening. I finally saw EGT drop after advancing the timing 3 degrees on my MVT digital direct ignition. But just as I saw a glimmer of hope, it damaged the piston, letting out a throttle around 70 miles per hour. I replaced the MVT ignition with a Stage 6 programmable PVL ignition, thinking that the high advance at lower RPM with the MVT could be to blame for the piston failure, but found the curves from Stage 6 had a lot of advance at low revs as well. I got another piston and damaged that with just 6 miles on it from brief wide open throttle. After going through a process that I detailed in the last video to get my observed timing to match the program timing using a flat ignition curve, I decided that maybe my best bet would be to use one of the curves that Malossi supplies with the MHR ignition because that's part of the RC1 kit. I downloaded a manual and found that there are 3 curves suggested for the 94cc. All of them were similar, so I made a custom curve to match the averages of their timing points and loaded that into the Stage 6 CDI. I was also wondering if fuel flow and bowl filling could be an issue, so I did a few tests to make sure that my tank and hoses were on par with past checks and bought a cheap clear bowl for the PWK. This bowl had an unwanted barb for power jet carbs that I simply blocked off with a vacuum cap. I set up a GoPro to watch the carb so I'd be able to tell if the bowl was draining at wide open throttle, and I installed a 200 main jet, which is on the larger side of what it has been using, so it would suck up a little more gas than normal and make fuel supply problems more likely. I did a couple of test runs before realizing that the carb camera was gone.
Okay, my camera's gone. Awesome. I gotta look for that.
But I finished the set of 4 runs without issue anyway. Luckily, I found the GoPro after an hour or so of searching the roadside, a little beat up, but still working just fine. I mounted the camera again and went out for more test runs. It looks like maybe there's a slight drop in fuel level, but there's plenty of gas in there when it shuts down, so I should be able to rule the bowl draining out. The engine wouldn't restart, so I wound up calling for help and later found a scuffed up piston and aluminum transfer on the cylinder. I really wasn't sure what to think of this. I had fuel in the bowl, and EGTs on the first 4 runs were actually low, averaging only 1130 degrees Fahrenheit, and EGT was under 1200 degrees when it died in the upper 60 mph range. For comparison, with the 28mm Del Orto, my best performance typically happens with temps around 1200 to 1250 at 60 mph, and usually gets into the mid to upper 1200s by the end of an 1/8 mile run. I had an HLJ needle in it at the time, which has a fatter tip than some of the other needles that I've used, but I would still think EGT should be high if that were the cause, and the performance otherwise seemed to indicate that it was on the rich side. I didn't see any roughness on the piston or peppering on the plug to indicate detonation. I wondered if the piston could be too tight in the bore, since I was using a BB piston in a cylinder originally marked as an A with an A piston. But measurements during installation showed piston to cylinder clearance ranging from 27 10,000ths to 29 10,000ths of an inch, and I was using a C piston with less clearance for 800 miles prior to the smaller BB that I went with, only because I couldn't get a C in a reasonable amount of time. When the engine was brand new, I measured 28 10,000ths of an inch of clearance, and Malossi specs are even tighter than that at 19 to 22. Though some have told me that Malossi never meets that spec in their experience either. The bore was now measuring up to 6 10,000ths of an inch larger after 3,000 miles and the recent failures. So I decided to get a whole new cylinder kit, also hoping that I'd be able to buy A pistons that are easier to find in stock. But of course the new kit was already oversized at AA. Looking for parts for your scooter? Check out ScooterTuning.Ca. Whether you're working on a 50cc or a 500cc, they've got performance parts for your stock engine. They've got entire racing engines. How about some brake upgrades? Maybe some new fairings? You can find high quality parts with fast, affordable shipping from ScooterTuning.Ca. They help to support this channel and other creators, so please support people that support the scooter community and shop at ScooterTuning.Ca. At this point, one of the car shows that I always attend was only a couple of weeks away, and I did not want to risk another issue with the PWK that would leave me waiting on parts, so I put the 28mm VHST back on. I did some easy break-in riding with the new kit, and then tried 1/8 mile runs to see how it was doing with the 28mm. Times were okay for me, in the high 9s, but EGT and RPM both seemed a little bit low. On the way home from test runs, I was checking part throttle and noticed an area with some noise that I thought may be detonation. I checked the plug when I got home and saw peppering or small dots on the porcelain, which indicates that there was indeed detonation. I raised the needle one position to richen part throttle and reduced the main jet size from 150 to 145 based on the lower EGT and RPM during test runs. I also modified the MHR ignition curve by setting 13,500 RPM, which is roughly peak power, at 15 degrees. Making a straight line between 10,000 and 13,500 to remove the bump up there, and retarding the entire curve by 1 degree. I don't normally like to make that many changes at once, but I needed a safe tune so I wouldn't damage another cylinder or piston. Performance didn't change much, but I didn't notice knock at part throttle anymore, so I called it good enough to take to the car show, and it ran strong there. I did have a lot of trouble with the idle. It started off needing a little adjustment, which is pretty normal for my trips to the beach, but it transitioned into not idling at all about 3 hours in. I had to turn the idle all the way up to 4,000 RPM or more, or it would die. It seemed like the idle circuit wasn't working, but I tried raising the needle and changing the spark plug, hoping one of those easier things would fix it anyway. They didn't, so I wound up taking the carb off and doing a little bit of a tailgate inspection where I found a clogged pilot jet. I had some wire in my toolkit, so I stripped the insulation back a little and cut off a single strand that I used to clean out the jet. It was back to idling fine after a little readjusting, so I went out for some more fun. Within an hour or less, it went back to no idle. It was about 11 p.m. by then, and I had been out there for 6 hours, so I just loaded up and headed home. I drained the carb to clean it the next day, and there was sediment in the fuel from the bowl. Once again, I found the pilot jet clogged, and I assumed that all of this was from the corrosion in this carburetor. This all started when I read rave reviews of Pine Sol as a carburetor cleaner online. It sounded like a lot of people love it, so I tried it. I used it in an ultrasonic cleaner with heat, as others reported doing. Unfortunately, it turned out as many things do for me, and my experience was contradictory to most others. My carburetor darkened and started corroding, and only seems to get worse and worse with time and use. What's odd about this is that the outside of the carburetor still looks okay, but the inside is terrible. The only theory that makes any sense to me is that there must be some sort of reaction between Pine Sol and the fuel or the oil that I use. The fuel is nothing special, I just use premium pump gas. The oil may be more unique to my circumstance for a couple of reasons, beginning with the fact that the majority of people cleaning carbs have no two-stroke oil present in their fuel, either because they're 4-strokes or they may use oil-injected 2-strokes. And second, there are lots of 2-stroke oils. I use AMSOIL Dominator Racing, which is a synthetic, but there are so many brands and types that maybe some react different with Pine Sol. Whatever the case may be, it's pretty safe to say that I won't be trying Pine Sol again with my 2-strokes. I soaked the carb in white vinegar for about an hour and let it run in the ultrasonic cleaner in the vinegar for another hour. Then I used brass brushes and wire wheels to try and get anything off that may be loose. The carb looked a lot better, so I got it running and idling well again and carried it to the beach for another day of the car show. I made it maybe 10 minutes before it started acting up again. I couldn't get anywhere, so I took it back to the truck and just headed home. These carbs aren't cheap, so I wanted to see if I could save it. I started with the usual carb cleaner and compressed air cleaning. Then I got a clear pot so we could watch while I boiled it in a vinegar and water mix, hoping that would help with corrosion and loose stuff in passages that are hard to reach. After 10 minutes of boiling, I flipped the carb around a different way, thinking that may help the process work on all areas of the carb a little bit better. Then the carb was cleaned again with carb cleaner before going into pure vinegar in the ultrasonic cleaner. I wound up with gray vinegar, but the carburetor didn't look much different. I cleaned it again with carb cleaner and compressed air. Earlier that day, I picked up a small, inexpensive media blasting gun from Harbor Freight, because I heard that soda blasting could be a good way to clean carbs as well, and could neutralize any leftover acidity from using vinegar. I've put some links to tools used in the description and Amazon links to similar tools as well. I figured with just an 18-ounce hopper on the gun, I shouldn't need much baking soda, and I had around 2 pounds at home anyway, so I didn't bother picking up a big bag, and that was probably a mistake. I started at 90 psi and went through a pound quickly. The outside looked nice, but the inside didn't change much. I turned air pressure up to 120 psi for a second attempt, using all of the other pound of baking soda that I had. It still worked about the same. If I had more baking soda, I could move a lot slower, and maybe that would help, but I don't think it would make a big difference, and I don't really want to try a more aggressive blast media on the inside of a carburetor. I think the little blaster could come in handy to have around, but it wasn't particularly useful here. I went over it again with carb cleaner and compressed air before reinstalling the VHST and taking a ride around town so it would spend a lot of time at low speed and idling. That went fine, so I thought maybe it was fixed, but I took another ride a couple of days later and it went back to not idling again with a clogged pilot. At that point, the carb was officially junk in my eyes. The car show was over, and the only other event that I was going to try to attend was the drag race at the Smoky Mountain Small Bore Rally. I checked with the event organizers, and I was the only person pre-registered for the two-stroke and scooter classes, so I wasn't going to drive 10 hours each way to have no one to race against. That meant that I had no good excuse not to give the PWK another shot. Well, I mean, aside from the time, cost, and aggravation of destroying more parts. I installed a 195 main jet and switched from the HLJ needle that I was using to a JJK needle that is much more commonly used and a little bit richer, hoping that this setup would work now that I have similar timing to people that I know the PWK works for on RC1s. I started doing test runs with different main jets, going larger and larger, and the results were weird. Times were good with most of the jets, but I was seeing EGT increase toward the end of runs as jetting got larger, and by the time I got to a 215 main jet, the engine died following the second 1/8 mile attempt. It never restarted, and I wound up finding just 65 psi of cranking compression caused by the piston ring sticking. I cut the spark plugs used for 195 to 215 main jets, and things got really confusing. The smoke ring looks alright to me at 205. But instead of getting thicker or darker, it goes away with the bigger jets. By 215, there was barely any color on the plug. This is not how plug reading typically works. Usually the smoke ring will get darker and thicker as jet size increases. If the ring does fade for me, it usually happens when there's so much fuel that it's washing things clean and the plug tends to be wet when removed. Here are 3 plugs from jet tests with the VHST shortly before the PWK was installed. Notice how the smoke ring is dark with the 140 main jet, and the others look more washed out from more fuel, but the coloring doesn't just disappear like it did on the plugs from the PWK. The only way these results make sense to me is if the bowl was running dry with the demands of larger jets and starving the engine for fuel. But I had observed the fuel level not really changing in a clear bowl not long ago. I was using the aluminum bowl during the last tests because clear bowls tend to degrade over time exposed to fuel. So I measured the aluminum bowl and found that it holds about 30 milliliters, as adjusted with the carb sitting at the same angle as it would on the engine. And the clear bowl held about 50 milliliters. Knowing this, it made sense to me to use the clear bowl to give me a bigger fuel reserve, even if I have to change the bowls out occasionally. But I noticed that the main jet sits far from the bottom of the clear bowl. If the main jet sits in the same spot, then I don't think a lot of the extra fuel serves any purpose since the main jet can't use it. I made this main jet extender from a piece of brass hex stock that's basically just an adapter with male M5 by 0.8mm thread on one end and female M5 by 0.8 on the other. Now jets sit roughly an 1/8 inch from the bottom of the clear bowl. I was afraid that any closer could cause problems with flow through the jet. I started to wonder, what if my main jets were improperly sized and actually got smaller instead of larger? That has happened to me in the past when using mixed and matched main jets, and I put a hole in a piston right after upjetting with the intention of making sure it was extra safe for a long ride. I took some admittedly crude measurements with a brass rod that I machined since I don't have jet drills or anything precise for the size required. But jet sizes at least appeared to increase with larger numbers as they should, so I reinstalled a 205 main jet and moved the clip down one notch to richen the needle setting. I looked over the piston with a stuck ring, and there wasn't anything that I was too worried about aside from the ring and the area around it. I removed the old ring and checked the fit of a new one, which was also a very tight fit. I used 220 and 400 grit sandpaper, trying to focus only on the top of the ringland that looked rough and not to sand the rear or innermost bit of the ringland because that could negatively affect sealing. I started out by just trying to get the ring to fit all around without binding. Then I kept sanding until 33 thousandths worth of feeler gauges would fit all the way around, which is what I had ringland thickness noted as from checking some past new pistons. Let me be clear, I would not recommend this to anyone else, because a new piston kit is the way to go. But failures seemed so likely for me with the PWK that I didn't want to spend any more money than I had to. I got it back together and checked compression, which looked good at 150 psi. It was obvious that the needle clip setting was rich, so I moved that to the leanest spot and later switched back to the HLJ because it was still too rich. I put the flat 16-degree timing curve back in the CDI and verified that timing was where I wanted it. Malossi specifies 16 degrees in their manual, which is very mild for anything other than peak power RPM, so it should be about as safe as I could get it. Then I started doing main jet testing again and filming the bowl. All jetting felt way off at low to even mid-throttle. It felt rich and resembled the feeling of a spark plug starting to foul, even with plugs being swapped before each test. Times were fairly consistent across the board, but I noticed that RPM was down more with the 210, EGT was cooler, and it acted up more at low throttle, so I retested that one in case it was a fluke, but the results were about the same. I then switched to the modified MHR ignition curve again, and noticed that increasing timing at lower RPM had cleared up the roughness and that fouled plug sort of feeling. It's no secret that higher advance at low RPM can be beneficial, but I've never had a programmable ignition before to test back-to-back, so it was pretty interesting for me to feel how much timing affected what could otherwise be passed off as the wrong needle or jetting. I tried a 215 and 220 main jet and found that EGT was about 20 degrees hotter with the MHR curve than the flat 16 degree timing, with no significant change in 1/8 mile performance. Looking at plugs from the different curves side by side, the flat timing curve produced darker and thicker smoke rings with everything else the same. But the most important thing that I see when looking at all recent plug chops together is that the mix ring is now doing what I expect for the most part. I can see that the old setup with a stock bowl leans out with larger jets, while the new setup with the main jet extender and clear bowl produces richer looking plugs with larger jetting. It never looked like the bowl was draining much from any video that I got of it, but maybe it was a totally different scenario in the stock aluminum bowl, and maybe I'll get lucky and this is the end of my troubles. I stuck with the 215 main jet and called that close enough for now, moving on to some roller weight tuning. On the second set of passes with different weights, a run started off just fine, and then RPM dropped suddenly, so I let out. It didn't quit running or start doing anything strange, so I tried again, but RPM and power were still down. A compression test showed 125 psi, down from 150 after assembly. The piston had little indentations on the crown, which I feared were from the ring locating pin coming out after I sanded the ringland. It turned out to be from the ends of the piston ring breaking off. Notice the ring on the left with tabs on the end versus this one on the right. I've never had that happen before, but the ring end gap was checked to be 1/1000th of an inch above spec before assembly, so the end shouldn't have butted up from insufficient clearance, which again leaves me wondering how responsible my sanding of the ringland was and why exactly it would do that. I had some time while waiting on a replacement piston, so I started doing some checks suggested by the members of the 49cc Scoot forum and Kiwi Biker. One suggestion was to check the carb, intake, and reads for any mismatches. As it turned out, I matched the intake to the read block the best I could during initial assembly with the PWK, but I totally forgot to match the intake to the carb, and there was a considerable mismatch there. I polished the mouth of the carb and the bell mouth and rounded the outer edge a little bit to make entry as smooth as I could. Eventually, I looked over the whole path from carb to transfers and even made a map of the port entry angles, but all of that looked fine. Exhaust stinger size was also mentioned as a potential problem. I didn't think the stinger diameter should be the issue, since the same exhaust had been on the engine since day one, and it worked just fine with the VHST. Plus, I knew 2 other people in person that used 34mm PWKs with the MHR exhaust, but I ran a bore scope in there and made sure it didn't look clogged up. The camera was too close to focus well, but it does look like there's a bit of a lump from the weld that reduces the size of the stinger entry a little bit. I decided not to try to fix it because it's right about here, which would mean I'd have to cut the pipe apart, grind it, and then re-weld it. And it's likely that my weld would end up as bad as theirs or worse. It was also suggested to look my main jets over very closely, especially the 210 main jet that I was using, which was richer than all of the jets around it. I had already checked orifice size, but I did find that the 210's entry looked totally different than the other jets from the same manufacturer. I have jets from different brands because I started out with stage 6 jet kits, but wound up wanting to try larger jets than any of their kits included, so I was curious if the way that they were made caused any significant differences in flow. I came up with a pretty simple rig to test jets. A 2-liter bottle with the bottom cut off holds a large amount of water with food coloring in it just to make it easy to see, and I marked a line which was 24 inches above the other end of the rig because testing with different volumes or heights would produce different results, so at least that way I could start each test at the same point. It would be best to keep a steady height and volume of fluid with a pump or some other system, but I wasn't looking to put that much effort into this sort of testing. A barb in the bottle cap allows me to attach hose with a manual shutoff valve in the middle. Main jets are pushed into the end of the hose, and then I could open the valve to let water flow through into a graduated beaker. I did 3 20-second long tests, refilling to the line on the bottle between each. Then all 3 20-second tests were added up to give me the flow per minute result. My thought was that 3 20-second tests allowed me to see if all checks were consistent, and also kept the fluid height higher throughout. I had jetting from stage 6, niche cycle, key-in, and I even ordered some cheap jets from Amazon sold as GZYF brand. Ideally, I would have liked to test a range of jets with the same sizes for all brands, but my collection didn't overlap like that. I made up a graph so it's easy to view the results. Looking at 150 through 195, where I had both key-in and stage 6 jets, both brands do basically what you'd expect as size increases, though I'd say key-in may have had a little more steady increase. Stage 6 flows a bit more, but the important part is that either brand looks like a decent choice with no oddities in my small test sample. The niche cycle jets start at 200, and you can clearly see that their 200 jet flows much less than key-in or stage 6 200s, and is more similar to key-in and stage 6 185 to 190 jets. This is a great example of why I tell everyone to get a complete set of jets from one manufacturer whenever possible. From 205 to 230, I had key-in, GZYF, and niche cycle jets. Again, key-in jets appear to continue a steady increase in flow through the entire range, and the GZYF jets aren't terrible, but as they get even larger, their 235 and 240 flowed less than their 230. In my opinion, the niche cycle jets are awful, with flow numbers all over the place. It's possible that I get a bad batch, but to me this looks like very poor quality control. At least the graph makes it easy to see why I had such odd readings with their 210 compared to the other jets near it. At the end of the graph is a jet that I drilled to 2.5 millimeters, which should be equivalent to a 250, and you can see that it flows just a little bit less than the GZYF 250. The main takeaways here are that you don't know what you're doing to the fuel mixture if you're mixing and matching jetting, and it definitely seems worth it to buy well-known, quality brands. I also started flow testing the carburetor itself, because I was curious if it was capable of moving enough fuel to supply whatever jetting I wanted to use. I found that the Polini PWK could flow about 410 milliliters per minute. I checked the 28mm Del Orto VHST, which flowed 520 milliliters per minute, and a 28mm Del Orto PHBH that flowed 420 milliliters per minute. For reference, the fuel system alone, with no carburetor attached, flowed 875 milliliters per minute, so it should not be a restriction for any of the carbs. So the PWK was at least comparable to one of the smaller Del Ortos, but the VHST that I've used most of the time on the RC1 flows about 24% more. I was told that drilling fuel passages to increase flow is a pretty common practice for these clone PWKs, and a member of the Kiwi Biker Forum even sent me a link to a French video by Zinzin Preparation that went over the process, and I've linked that in the description of this video as well. Fuel comes in from this barb and travels down to a passage behind this plug to make its way to the float needle seat area to enter the bowl. And that's basically the path that needs to be modified to increase flow to fill the bowl faster. Step 1 was to get the brass plug out of the way, so I marked it with a center punch and drilled it out. Then I used a 4mm bit to drill straight into that passage until I could see the tip of the drill bit when looking down the hole in the float needle seat. Don't drill any deeper than that. It won't help, and you may damage other components. I also ran the bit into the barb because it wasn't quite as large as the new passage size, but thick enough that I didn't think there was any risk. Next up are these holes that let fuel flow from the seat area into the bowl. All 4 were drilled to 2.5mm. Then I used a 3.5mm bit to deburr the outside of each. A small fine file was used to deburr the inside of them. I did not touch the hole at the needle seat because it would be very easy to ruin the seal of the float needle that way. I cleaned thoroughly with compressed air and carburetor cleaner, then used a Q-tip to finish cleaning the float needle area. I put a fresh Q-tip in a drill and used a small amount of metal polish to smooth the whole needle passage. These air vent passages were drilled with a 3/32 of an inch bit, just a little smaller than 2.5mm, to make sure there's sufficient ventilation. All that was left was to plug the hole in the side of the carburetor, so I tapped it just deep enough to install an M5 by 0.8 set screw that was 6mm long. I looked into the fuel inlet to be sure that the set screw wasn't too long and blocking the passage. I also added a very small amount of JB weld to the threads before use to be sure that it was sealed. The entire carburetor was cleaned, and then I had one more mod to do to the float bowl. There's a peg inside of most bowls that acts as a float stop, preventing the float from opening beyond a certain point. That can be ground down, or in the case of plastic bowls, even cut off, so the floats can drop as far as possible and let fuel in as quickly as possible. I checked flow after the mods, and the carb went from flowing 410 milliliters per minute to 560, or about a 31% increase. Other thoughts and suggestions were that the atomizer should have no holes, backed up with a statement that genuine keying carbs don't use holes and don't use different atomizers or emulsion tubes as a tuning adjustment like the Polini PWK and other clones do. I would have been willing to try it, but there are no zero-hole atomizers that I can find to fit this carb, and I assume that if I tried to solder the holes shut in one, most likely I'd change the inside diameter of the tube, and I can't precisely drill or bore something that size. I did try a 20-hole atomizer in place of the 30-hole at one point, but I couldn't tell any difference. I didn't want to spend a few $100s on a genuine key in PWK, and they don't seem to make a 34mm, but I did pick up a clone for under $30 on AliExpress because some people have said that the clone carbs can be practically identical to the real thing. The fake was certainly convincing with its packaging. It did have an atomizer with 8 holes though, rather than a solid tube. I would have considered trying the carb, but the needle bushing would just fall out, when normally those are a mild press fit. It would not be good if that wound up being sucked into the engine, and almost equally important to me is that the fit would indicate poor tolerances and quality control, and I don't need more problems right now, so this carb is a no-go for me for sure. Another suggestion was to use a detonation gauge, which I didn't even know existed to be honest, but apparently they're used by some kart racers and other high-end two-stroke tuners. Basically, it's a gauge that monitors a knock sensor, and a series of green, yellow, and red lights tell you when detonation is present and how severe it is. This gauge was about $100 from an eBay seller, and did not include a knock sensor, but they did list a couple of sensors that could be used, and I picked up this Bosch sensor and an EV1 pigtail for connecting it because the sensor design looked easier to work with than the other option. The gauge appears to be a sort of homebrew setup with a circuit board inside of a box with holes drilled in it for wires and lights to come out of. Nothing was sealed, so I took the cover off and used clear silicone to try and seal around the lights and wires, also hoping that the silicone may reinforce the wires to some small degree, because the tiny soldered connections had nothing else to prevent them from being pulled if the wires were pulled. Wiring the gauge was pretty straightforward, just power wires and a shielded cable to the sensor. I made a bracket to add the knock gauge to my existing gauge mount and aim its indicator lights toward me, so hopefully they should be easier to see. The gauge had no mounting holes, so double-sided tape was the easiest option. Mounting the knock sensor took a little more work. I made a brass adapter in the mini lathe that would fit the contours of the outer head well and was a snug fit for the sensor, so it would have good contact with the engine. I added a ferrite core to the sensor wiring as an added measure to help prevent or at least reduce electromagnetic interference from the ignition system. Tapping on the head or sensor with metal objects made the gauge light up, so it seemed like it should be working. As an added safety measure, I created what I call a conservative ignition map that reduces timing a little across the board, but should have enough advance that it won't feel weak or foul plugs quickly. The new piston came in, so I got the engine back together and headed out for a break-in ride. I didn't even make it 50 feet before the engine died, and then it was seized and couldn't be turned over.
What the hell? Well, good thing I got up early for this.
When I took the engine apart, I found that one of the circlips had dislodged from the piston and wound up embedded in the cylinder wall, ruining the entire kit. I noticed that the remaining circlip was easy to move in its groove, requiring hardly any effort, and that made me wonder if my failure was related to the assembly or improperly fitting parts. I never filmed the engine assembly because I've had this thing apart and back together so many times fixing failures since the PWK that it's really nothing special anymore. But I used the circlip installer that I've used since the first time I put the engine together. Honestly, I don't know that I even touched the clips once installed, which is my mistake and won't happen again after this lesson, but I did look at them and both appeared to be seated as they should be. Unfortunately, all I could do now was order another whole new kit and vow to never install a piston again without at least poking at the circlip a bit to make sure it's in well and fits well. The new kit came in and I decided to make a couple more changes. The first is simple. I wanted to use the Denso IW34 plug that Malossi specifies for the RC1. I've been using NGK BR9EG and BR10EG, which are both hotter than the Denso. They haven't been a problem with the VHST, and using the BR9 has helped a lot in reducing fouling when I go to car shows where I tend to idle and operate at low throttle most of the time. But I wanted to rule out the possibility that a hotter plug has anything to do with these failures with the PWK. I've also noted since day one that the ports sit below the edge of the piston crown a little bit at bottom dead center. It's not much, only about a ½ millimeter. So I found that switching from typically using 0.2 to 0.3 millimeter base gaskets to using 0.7 millimeters would put the port floors flush with the piston crown. I've always heard and read that flush is the best for flow and allowing mixture to better cool the piston crown, and that has been said by some of the greats of two-stroke tuning. The only difficult part is trying to get squish clearance correct after moving the cylinder up, but I had 3 heads, so I wasn't worrying about trying to cut one to get squish in spec. As expected, I had to cut about a ½ millimeter off of the head. For final assembly, I gave all 3 of the base gaskets a very light coat of Permatex Ultra Gray, which has worked out fine. Alright, so let's give this another go. I took an easy break-in ride and noticed that the detonation gauge never lit more than a single green light that indicates that it's on. It's supposed to have the power light on, and then the next 1 or 2 green lights should be on steadily, or at least flashing, due to regular engine noise, with more lights then indicating that detonation is present. The gauge has a sensitivity dial that can be adjusted to help it work with different engines and sensors, so I pulled over to turn that up, but the dial just spun around and around easily, and I'm pretty sure it's broken.
Seems to just free spin, so that's probably a great sign. There's no pressure, it's just free spinning. Awesome.
I checked it later with the engine off, and now it doesn't respond to tapping on the engine or sensor like it did when freshly installed.
First run, done. Perfect.
I made it to 57 miles per hour with EGT at 1222 on the first pass, and it died, then having very little compression.
Hey, let's just throw all our money in the trash can.
The piston had expanded and scuffed itself, and put aluminum on the cylinder, as well as trapping the ring and damaging it. Luckily, the cylinder was salvageable, but it would need yet another new piston kit. I chopped the spark plug, and it looks alright to me. The mixture ring looks good considering it only had 1 burst of wide open throttle for maybe 7 or 8 seconds. So now I'm lost. This should have been the safest run I've ever done with a PWK, but instead it ate a piston quicker than ever before. I've got more fuel flow, more fuel in the bowl, the main jet sitting deeper in the fuel, less ignition timing, a colder plug, a smoother and better matched inlet path, and basically the whole setup has been gone over, and I couldn't even make a single 0 to 60 pass. Meanwhile, I had talked to Ryan Ott, who used the same carb on his RC1, and a local that has a stage 6 34mm PWK on his RC1, and both told me that setup was simple for them. This is the same story that I see on the internet. People say that PWKs are easy to tune on just about anything. Listen, I know I'm not the smartest or best tuner out there, but I also know I'm not the worst or dumbest person to ever touch a PWK. I can't find any reason that this is happening, and none of the very intelligent people that have been kind enough to try and help me seem to know either. The idea that makes the most sense to me at this point is that it could be related to intake velocity, which should slow with the addition of the big carb and big intake. I have ported my cases more than some, which was all done on initial assembly, but we should be talking about pretty minor changes. Nothing like when I backfill entrenched Minarelli engines. Flat slide carburetors are new to me. I had Electron on my TPR 86cc, and that was similar to this experience. It melted pistons at part throttle instead of wide open throttle generally, but I could never seem to get it right and gave up going back to a round slide Del Orto. That engine is still running today after years and thousands more miles without any similar issues. I have proven with the RC1 that I can put the 28mm VHST back on and life goes back to normal. It's only when the PWK is installed that I have constant failures. I've kept at it for a long time trying to figure out why this stuff keeps happening, but I've accomplished nothing. I still have no idea why this is so hard for me and seemingly easy for everyone else. To make matters worse, with one fail after the next for basically a year, I had to sell some stuff that I didn't even really want to sell just to be able to keep up and get the last new cylinder kit. This PWK swap is breaking me in nearly every way, and I no longer even enjoy the scooter. I'm certainly not proud to say that the PWK beat me, but I think it may have. I'm no longer willing to tear up parts trying to figure it out. At the time of the last failure, Bike Week and the Fall Car Show were right around the corner, and I always look forward to those events, so I called it quits and put the Del Orto back on, and guess what? I attended those events and more without issue and had a great time, and I've continued to do many acceleration passes as well. All the PWK ever gave me was headaches. I thought it had some potential to improve my 8th mile times, but I never got there. Anytime I thought it was in tune, it would blow up again. I'm going to end this video, and let's hope all PWK videos right here. As always, please be sure to give the video a like if you've enjoyed it or found it helpful, and thank you for watching.